Brian Entin wasn't chasing a bombshell when this one reportedly landed in his lap. It came through a source, a document, and a single overlooked detail tucked inside an investigative file. But the moment he realized what he was looking at, the entire timeline around Nancy Guthrie's disappearance seemed to rearrange itself. The detail that stopped him cold involved Annie Guthrie. In the weeks before Nancy vanished, Annie may not have been quietly bracing for bad news, or simply waiting by the phone. According to what Brian was told, she had quietly thrown herself into an investigation of her very own. It was a private obsession, the kind that unfolds far from cameras and crowds. Her friends apparently had no idea. Investigators had no clue. Even the people who thought they knew Annie's every move had no sense of just how many hours she was pouring into a subject she was determined to crack. The research reportedly involved late-night sessions on her computer, repeated trips to a library, scrubbed browser histories, and a handwritten notebook kept apart from her everyday belongings. None of it was visible to the people closest to her. Brian only learned about it when a source showed him what investigators had pulled from Annie's devices, what had been jotted down in that notebook, and how deep the material actually ran. While the public assumed Annie was sitting around waiting for answers, the evidence hinted she had been hunting for them herself. Once investigators started connecting the dots of what she'd been digging into, the weeks before Nancy disappeared took on a completely different shape. To grasp why the discovery landed with such force, it helps to remember how Annie had always been seen by the people around her. She wasn't known as volatile or controversial. There was no reputation for instability, no suspicious circle of associates, nothing in her past that would have naturally pointed investigators her way. Instead, Annie came across as composed, private, dependable, and grounded. She was the type who handled heavy responsibilities quietly and never chased credit. When trouble surfaced, she was the one who showed up, did what needed doing, and refused to turn personal hardship into a public spectacle. Her bond with Nancy was also described as something genuinely deep. This wasn't just a connection between relatives. Their relationship had been forged through years of shared history, loyalty, and family pressure, circumstances that seemed to pull them even closer. When Nancy vanished, Annie was among the first people questioned, and she reportedly cooperated with investigators from the very start. She shared what she knew about Nancy's contacts, routines, relationships, and habits. She joined search efforts and spoke publicly when she felt the moment called for it. When she didn't need to be in front of a camera, she stepped back. Week after week, as the investigation churned on with few visible answers, Annie kept a calm, composed, public face. That was the image everyone recognized. Because her behavior seemed so steady, there was little reason for anyone to look beneath the surface. But according to the material Brian reviewed, Annie had already been quietly investigating something on her own, and she'd started before Nancy ever disappeared. That timing is the detail that flips the story. The examination of Annie's phones and computers was reportedly part of a wider effort to comb through the digital activity of everyone close to Nancy. She wasn't being scrutinized because she'd been named a suspect or publicly flagged as a person of interest. Her devices were apparently swept in as part of a routine search for anything that might illuminate Nancy's life and the circumstances around her disappearance. Instead, investigators spotted a pattern in Annie's activity. Digital behavior tends to mirror a person's routine. Over time, it can reveal when someone is working, sleeping, traveling, or burning the midnight oil. Annie's activity reportedly stood out because so much of it was happening overnight. Not just once or twice, but again and again across several weeks. There could have been innocent explanations. Maybe she was battling insomnia, wrestling with stress, or lying awake over personal worries. But the nature of the searches reportedly made the activity harder to wave off. These weren't scattered or casual clicks. They looked organized, methodical, and connected, as if Annie had been working from a plan. Then came the deleted material. Large chunks of Annie's browsing history had apparently been wiped, but the deletions weren't described as one clean sweep of the device. Certain date ranges had vanished while others survived. Specific sessions were missing, yet the surrounding activity remained intact. That kind of selective removal suggested Annie may have known precisely which records she wanted gone. She hadn't erased everything, and that may have helped investigators reconstruct pieces of what had been deleted. Still, the pattern reportedly made clear that she understood her browsing history could expose where she'd been looking and what she'd been trying to learn. The phone records added another layer. Annie had reportedly placed calls at odd hours to several numbers that didn't show up in her regular contacts. One number stood out because it was prepaid and had no registered owner attached to it. According to reports, Annie reached out to that number several times over a 2-week stretch, with each call running under 3 minutes. The calls were short enough to feel like quick check-ins rather than real conversations. There were no long talks or extended chats captured in the available material. Instead, the pattern suggested someone reaching out for information, confirmation, or direction without formally saving that person's identity in her phone. Her library visits were just as unusual. Records and security footage reportedly showed Annie stopping by the library 4 times over roughly 3 weeks. Before that, she hadn't been there in years. She wasn't casually browsing shelves or killing an afternoon with a book. She asked for specific public records, archived newspapers, and collections of court documents. That kind of research usually begins with a particular question in mind. It implies someone already knows which dates, names, or subjects they need to find. It can also be a way to examine older material without leaving the same digital footprint that online searches from home would create. Investigators also turned up a notebook in a desk drawer at Annie's residence. It wasn't hidden in some elaborate spot, which only made the discovery harder to read. Maybe Annie figured the notebook would look ordinary if anyone found it. Maybe she planned to move it later, or maybe she never got the chance. The pages reportedly held tightly packed dates, names, abbreviations, addresses, arrows, question marks, and circled entries. It didn't read like a personal diary or a jumble of stray thoughts. It looked more like a working file, assembled by someone tracking connections and recording details as they surfaced. The subject of Annie's research made the notebook even more significant. One of the earliest threads involved property records. Annie had reportedly been collecting ownership documents tied to a cluster of remote rural parcels. These weren't well-known locations or high-profile properties. On the surface, they looked like ordinary pieces of land held under names recorded in official documents. But Annie didn't appear to be gathering the records at random. She pulled them in a sequence that linked one owner to the next. One transaction led to another, and one name pointed toward the next. Taken alone, the documents might have seemed unremarkable. Together, they appeared to form a chain. When investigators cross-referenced the names Annie had flagged, the pattern reportedly demanded a closer look. Her interest wasn't simply in who owned the land at any given moment. She seemed to be examining how ownership had shifted and whether those changes connected to other people, businesses, or events. The property records were only one piece of her research. Annie had also searched newspaper archives stretching back years before Nancy's disappearance. She wasn't focused on current coverage of the case. She was digging into older stories from a period that seemed to have no obvious connection to Nancy or Annie. The dates she requested were reportedly so specific that investigators believed she already had a reason to zero in on them. She didn't appear to be flipping through old news out of idle curiosity. Instead, she seemed to be hunting for confirmation of a theory, or trying to verify information she'd received from somewhere else. A file recovered from Annie's devices offered another clue. It contained a series of GPS coordinates arranged in a way that suggested they'd been copied from another source rather than created from scratch. Investigators reportedly checked each location and found that many were remote, off-road spots that wouldn't normally show up in an average person's navigation history. Several coordinates lined up with properties Annie had already been tracing through ownership records. Others matched locations that had briefly surfaced during the early stages of Nancy's disappearance before fading from public view. That overlap was hard to write off as coincidence. Annie appeared to have been mapping a network before Nancy vanished. The locations she collected intersected with details that later became relevant to the case. If the research and the disappearance were unrelated, the overlap would be tough to explain. If they were connected, the coordinates could stand as one of the clearest signs that Annie knew something, before anyone else realized it mattered. Then investigators found a name that kept coming back. It wasn't Nancy's name, and it wasn't someone immediately recognizable from the public investigation. The name appeared again and again in Annie's notebook, sometimes circled, sometimes underlined, and often tied to different dates or locations. When investigators looked into it, they reportedly found links to one of the property chains, to one of the archived newspaper dates, and to financial records Annie had collected. The name to be one of the central threads tying much of her research together. The financial records were extensive. Annie had reportedly accessed court filings, civil litigation documents, bankruptcy records, and other administrative materials that most people would never think to search. She seemed to know exactly where those records were stored and how to find them. She printed documents tied to the recurring name and annotated them by hand. Figures were circled, entries were linked with lines, and notes filled the margins. Her focus seemed to be on the money trail, suggesting she believed financial activity might explain the connection between the individuals, businesses, and properties she'd been investigating. The satellite images were perhaps the most unsettling part of the collection. Investigators reportedly found 11 high-resolution images printed from publicly available mapping services. Annie had marked access roads, highlighted buildings, and circled areas that appeared to show possible disturbance on the ground. Using open-source mapping tools, she had created what looked like a remote survey of the locations connected to her research. The images lined up with the GPS coordinates, the property records, the financial documents, and the name that appeared repeatedly in her notebook. When the research was laid out in chronological order, the sequence became even more striking. About 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared, Annie reportedly began pulling property records. The first ownership trail led to a parcel roughly 40 miles from the search areas authorities would later establish. She then cross-referenced the owner's name with court filings and reportedly found a connection to an old financial dispute involving a company that had dissolved years earlier. That was apparently the first moment the recurring name appeared in her notebook. The following day, Annie visited the library and requested newspaper editions tied to an older local story. The article itself had no obvious public link to Nancy or Annie, but the precision of the dates suggested Annie already knew where to look. She may have stumbled onto the story through earlier research, or she may have been pointed toward it by someone else. In the early morning hours that followed, the GPS file was created. Metadata reportedly placed the activity somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. Annie appeared to have stayed awake, compiling coordinates from sources investigators have not publicly identified. By then, her research had moved beyond collecting names and documents. She was mapping locations. The next day, she printed the satellite images and began marking them by hand. Later that afternoon, phone records reportedly showed Annie driving toward one of the areas she had mapped. There's no confirmed record that she stopped at the destination, but her route reportedly took her in that direction. The following day, she spent hours searching public court databases and connecting the owner of one property to a second name that hadn't previously appeared in her notebook. That second name was eventually added to the page, circled and connected to the first. Later that evening, Annie made another short call to the prepaid number. The call reportedly lasted about 90 seconds. She didn't make any notebook entries that day, leaving investigators to wonder whether the information exchanged during the call stayed in her memory rather than being written down. The following Monday, her digital activity reportedly dropped sharply. There were no major searches, no obvious file transfers, and no new library visit. For roughly 3 days, the research appeared to stop. Then Nancy Guthrie disappeared. The timing raises a string of unsettling questions. Annie had apparently completed a significant portion of her research before Nancy vanished. The names, addresses, coordinates, property records, financial documents, and satellite images were already in place. Did Annie know something was about to happen? Had she come close to uncovering an answer, but failed to act before it was too late? Or did her investigation somehow trigger events she never expected? At this point, none of those possibilities has been confirmed. Other physical details have also drawn attention. Investigators reportedly found a gas receipt in Annie's vehicle from the Thursday 1 week before Nancy disappeared. That was reportedly the same day Annie drove toward one of the locations shown in her research. The gas station was roughly 50 minutes from Annie's home and sat along the route to a place she had already studied using satellite images. There were no notebook entries explaining the trip. All investigators had was the receipt, the time, and the possibility that Annie traveled there and returned without recording what she may have seen. Then there's page 19 of the notebook. Unlike most of the surrounding pages, page 19 contained very little writing. It reportedly included a date, an address, a time, and one additional word that investigators have not publicly released. The date was the same day Nancy disappeared. The time was in the early morning, and the address hadn't appeared anywhere else in Annie's research. Investigators reportedly went to that location, and Brian later confirmed through a source that what they found led to a separate investigative thread. That discovery was important enough to stand apart from the rest of the case. Yet the public still doesn't know what was found there or how it connects to Nancy's disappearance. There was also a separate phone call placed 11 days before Nancy vanished. This time, Annie reportedly called a business number tied to a company that had officially dissolved 2 years earlier. The call lasted roughly 1 minute and 40 seconds. Investigators tracked down people associated with the company, but no one reportedly admitted to receiving the call. That unanswered contact became another loose thread connecting Annie's activity to a business that no longer officially existed. A partially recovered email added still more questions. Forensic examination reportedly showed that Annie had drafted and deleted a message during a single session. Only part of the recipient address could be recovered, but the domain fragment appeared to match an entity connected to the financial records she'd been studying. That suggested Annie may have tried to contact someone directly within the network she was researching. The content of the message has not been recovered, leaving investigators without a clear explanation of what she intended to say. The storage unit discovered later provided perhaps the biggest shift to the timeline. It was located away from Annie's home and had been registered under another name, although investigators eventually connected it back to her. Inside, they reportedly found a second archive containing printed records and an earlier notebook. That material pushed Annie's research back by months. She had apparently been studying these connections far longer than anyone initially realized. Keeping the information away from her home also raises questions. It could mean Annie was worried about someone finding it. It could suggest she wanted a backup location for the material. Or it may simply have been a practical way to store documents she'd accumulated. Whatever the reason, the off-site archive gave investigators a much broader view of what she'd been doing. Brian Entin continued following the story through sources willing to speak privately, even when officials declined to confirm the details publicly. One former neighbor reportedly told him that Annie's daily routine had shifted in the months before Nancy vanished. Lights stayed on at her home late into the night. Her vehicle was sometimes gone before sunrise and back before most neighbors were awake. Conversations that had once been casual became less frequent, and Annie seemed distracted. At the time, those changes could have been written off as stress or personal concerns. In hindsight, the neighbors saw them differently, suggesting Annie may have been actively focused on something rather than simply struggling emotionally. Brian also spoke with an unidentified local official who reportedly had direct knowledge of the investigation. According to that source, the storage unit discovery changed investigators' understanding of the timeline. The earlier notebook demonstrated that Annie's research began months before Nancy vanished. That meant Annie wasn't simply reacting to the disappearance. She had apparently been investigating something before there was an official case, before the public began asking questions, and before anyone had reason to believe Nancy would soon be missing. A longtime friend, also speaking anonymously, recalled Annie asking a strange question during the months before the disappearance. She reportedly wondered what a person should do if they knew something was wrong but had no proof. At the time, the question sounded hypothetical. After the notebook and storage unit were discovered, it appeared much more personal. It raised the possibility that Annie had been wrestling with information she didn't know how to present or verify. Brian also consulted a researcher familiar with the public records Annie had accessed. That person reportedly said the sequence of searches showed more than casual curiosity. Annie moved through the records efficiently and requested specific documents with a level of focus that suggested experience, preparation, or guidance. That created another major mystery. If Annie wasn't conducting the research entirely on her own, who was helping her? Was someone feeding her names, dates, and locations? Was she following instructions from an individual outside the investigation? Or had she simply developed a sophisticated method of tracking public information by herself? As details spread, online communities began spinning their own theories. On Reddit, many users focused on the second name that appeared after Annie reviewed the financial filings. Some argued that the two circled names represented more than a simple property transaction. According to one theory, the names could reflect two levels of the same relationship, with one person appearing publicly while another remained hidden behind them. Supporters of that idea believe Annie may have identified an intermediary and was trying to discover who was truly directing the activity. Facebook groups have taken a different approach. Some users have tried to recreate Annie's research, using the public details available to them. One group claims to have identified the cluster of properties Annie was following and has shared aerial images that members believe show more activity than official records would suggest. Those findings have not been publicly confirmed by investigators. They remain part of the online discussion rather than established evidence. YouTube commentators have largely focused on the storage unit and the earlier notebook. Several popular videos argue that the notebook transforms the story because it indicates Annie had been collecting information before anyone else understood its significance. One frequently repeated question isn't what Annie was researching, but who first pointed her in that direction. If the research began months before Nancy disappeared, then something must have sparked Annie's interest. Local rumors have added yet another unverified claim. According to people discussing the case in the area, Annie may have met with someone from outside the region in the weeks leading up to Nancy's disappearance. Brian Entin has not confirmed that report, although he has also not entirely ruled it out. From all of these details, 4 major theories have emerged. The first is that Annie may have discovered something about Nancy's life that Nancy herself didn't fully understand, and that Annie was trying to protect her. The second theory is that Annie may have identified a dangerous third party whose relationship with Nancy began long before the disappearance. The third suggests that Annie may have been receiving information from someone connected to the official investigation. The fourth possibility is that Annie's research and Nancy's disappearance share only a general overlap. Under that explanation, Annie may have been examining the same people, properties, or historical events without those subjects necessarily being responsible for what happened to Nancy. None of these theories has been confirmed. None has been completely disproved either. Then Brian's reporting reportedly produced the revelation that changed the entire direction of the story. Until that point, the public and possibly some investigators had assumed Annie's work was leading toward a person. The names, documents, financial records, and property connections all appeared to point toward an individual or a group. But a source close to the investigation reportedly said that interpretation was incomplete. The earlier notebook recovered from the storage unit suggested that Annie's original focus wasn't a person at all. It was a location. That location had a documented history and was connected to events that had occurred years before Nancy disappeared. Those earlier events had reportedly been investigated but eventually closed without a clear resolution. In the years afterward, the property changed hands several times. Annie apparently didn't view those ownership changes as routine. Instead, she seemed to believe they represented an effort to hide the location's history through paperwork, transfers, and time. That meant Annie didn't begin with a suspect. She began with a place. She appears to have believed something happened there, and that the truth had been buried beneath legal documents, changing ownership records, and the passage of years. The location reportedly connected not directly to Nancy, but to someone who had been part of Nancy's orbit long before the disappearance. That person's relevance had never been examined because no one knew there was a reason to investigate the connection. Annie found the link and began documenting it. Her work may not have been designed to answer only who could have taken Nancy. It may have been an attempt to understand why someone would want to harm or target her. If Annie's theory was correct, the motive may have originated long before Nancy vanished. It may have been connected to a buried history that had never been properly explored, potentially explaining some of the unanswered gaps in the official investigation. Brian has continued working to verify the significance of that location and determine how it connects to the present case. What he has reportedly confirmed is that once investigators understood the location was the starting point of Annie's research, rather than a person, their interpretation of her work changed. The individuals involved may still be important, but the place appears to be where Annie's investigation began. Then came another reported development. 2 days ago, Brian received a document from an unnamed source through a channel he has chosen not to identify. He has said the document came from outside the official investigation and that its contents were checked against known facts through several independent confirmations. The document was only 1 page, but Brian said it contained 4 details that could prove highly significant. The first was a name. It was reportedly not one that had previously been publicly connected to Nancy's case, and it didn't appear among the names already written in Annie's notebook. When Brian examined it, the name didn't immediately fit into the known record of Nancy's disappearance. However, it did connect to the location Annie had been researching, the same place with the unusual history and complicated ownership trail. The connection reportedly extended even further back than the events Annie had already traced. The second detail was an address. It was the same address written on page 19 of Annie's notebook, the page marked with the date Nancy disappeared, the early morning time, and the undisclosed word. It was also the address investigators had reportedly visited after discovering the notebook entry. The third detail was a date that hadn't yet arrived when Brian received the document. According to his account, the date fell within the next active investigative period. Whoever sent the page appeared to believe that something would happen, or needed to happen, by that time. The fourth detail was a photograph. Brian has reportedly avoided describing the image in full, saying only that it shows a location familiar to people who have followed the case closely. He also indicated that the photograph helped him understand Annie's hidden research in a new way. It may explain why she kept her work private and why she could have been afraid to share everything she knew with the people around her. Brian has not claimed to understand the complete meaning of the document. He has not identified where the investigation will lead next, but he has said one thing with confidence. Annie Guthrie found something real. She spent weeks documenting a connection between Nancy's world and a buried history that existed before the disappearance. The unanswered question is whether Brian's new document finally links that history to Nancy's fate, or whether it represents another layer of a mystery that continues to expand. For now, the significance remains unconfirmed. But the latest information suggests that investigators may be closer to the truth than they were before, and that the public may also be approaching a discovery Annie had been working toward in secret.